Security, Part 2. In this nugget, we talk about security, and this is Part 2, where we start off with a discussion of access control. And a big part of that is identifying what various groups can do. I mean, if you're a member of the users groups, what can you do? If you're a member of the administrators group, what can you do? So we need to know what the various groups are capable of doing so that we can anticipate what someone might be capable of. And then we also can identify the ability to secure our networks. There's a number of different ways of doing this as well. And we'll see that one of the principal ways, of course, would be through something like a firewall solution. But one of the other things that we need to secure, which is growing in popularity, though, is wireless networks. We see a couple of different kinds of encryption technology, primarily, that can be used. But we need to make sure that we secure them as best that we can. We also need to make sure that we have a company policy in place for corporate networks. This is important because if something goes wrong, we need to have it clearly spelled out who should get the call, whose pager number you dial, and what procedure you go through to handle any kind of an emergency. That will help to avoid panic situations where you're not quite sure what to do or who to call. And generally, the more specific the company policy, the better it's going to be. And this also, of course, encompasses what user requirements are for your users as well. Now, an important part of any security plan is to know who can access what. For the first thing to be aware of is various security groups, and here's some operating system defaults for Windows 2000 and XP. These are default security groups. Security groups. Don't grope people, that would be rude. One of the first groups we have here is the guests group. Now, there's a member of the guest group, and that is the guest security account. Now let's take a look at that guest account. If we go into Start, and then we go into Control Panel, and then we go up here to User Accounts and double-click there, we'll see that we do have a guest account. By default, in Windows XP Home and Professional, that account is off. And technically, when it says the account is off, that's just kind of a user-friendly way of saying that that account is disabled. That means that I cannot log on as the guest account. Well, why would I want to enable this account? Well, for home computers and XP Professional computers that are, for example, a member of a work group and not a member of a corporate domain, this might be handy. For example, my sister recently came to visit, and she did not have an account to log on with. I was too lazy to create an account for her on one of our systems, so I just went ahead and enabled the guest account. With that, she was able to do basic functions. She could access the internet, and she could use it to check her webmail and things like that, but she would not be able to access any of the user files that were stored on the hard drive or to get any other kinds of access. With the guest account also, you're not required a password, and that's part of the purpose of it, so that it's easy to access and nobody has to memorize anything. This person who is a guest also cannot install any hardware or software. They can't change their account type to give themselves administrative privileges. They cannot change the picture even for the guest account. They can't change off of this little suitcase little icon. So it's a very limited account, but that's okay. It's just designed to give someone guest access, just the way the name implies. Now, if we decide that we want to enable this guest account, what do? I simply click it, and then I turn on the guest account. Now, I can do that from within Windows XP Professional. If it's Windows XP Home Edition, I have to restart the computer and start up in safe mode in order to be able to do this. So just be aware of that. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the guest account. Like any other account, generally speaking, you want to turn off or disable or delete any accounts that you don't need or that are not for current users. And this is simply because we don't want to leave an account out there that a hacker could potentially exploit. So maybe Clyde here, for example, had a very weak password. Well, if he doesn't log on to the computer regularly, I might want to disable his account just in case he did choose a weak password and one that would be easy to exploit by a hacker. Even if the opportunity seems kind of remote, we generally try to lock everything down that we can, and we only enable stuff that we absolutely have to. And then you can always check the security group membership if you're not sure of who belongs to which group by going into computer management, where you've seen me go many times before. And then within groups, you can check the members of a specific group. And again, once again, the guest is a member of the guest's security group. And then you can do the same thing. Now, this computer that we're looking at right now is a member of the domain. So if I look in other groups, such as the user security group, we'll see that the key thing here is that domain users are a member of the user's security group. And then the the other key thing is that for the administrator's local group, the domain admins is a member of this security group. It's really not that domain admins on their own have any specific power, but if the group is nested inside of any administrator's group, then they have full control over the local system. Likewise, users will have a level of access on a local system because the domain users are a member of the users security group locally here as well. Now then, what can the user's security group do? Well, they can just pretty much use the operating system. They can use any applications that are already installed. They can go ahead and use any hardware that's already there. They can access their own files with full control. So they pretty much have all productivity purposes enabled that a normal user would have to have. They probably will not be restricted from doing anything that's important. The possible exception to this would be that some of the older applications might give them some problems. And these would be applications written probably for Windows 95, for example, that try to access protected parts of the registry or the file system. If that's the case, you might be forced to take some of these users and add them instead to the power users security group, which is somewhere between the users group and the administrator security group in terms of the level of privilege. So that might help it out, but you also could potentially compromise a little bit of security there as well, because you might be giving those users a little bit too much privilege. And privilege is also an important concept within Windows. We try to implement something called the principle of least privilege. And this means that we try to give ourselves only the least amount of privilege that we possibly can and still get our jobs done. And this applies to our users, even administrators as well. So if I'm a member of the local administrators group, perhaps I'm a domain admin, for example, and I have that capability, I usually will not log on to computers as a domain admin so that I'm a member of this security group, because that would really be more power than I need to check email and write Word documents. I don't really need that much. All I want to be able to do is access the applications that have already been installed. Sometimes I want to print something out. I want to check my email. I want to surf the web. If that's the only kind of stuff that I'm doing, I should not log on as a member of the administrator's security group. And the reason for that is, let's say that I do log on and for some reason my account gets compromised and a hacker figures out my password, for example. Well, if that's the case and I'm logged on as a domain admin, which is a member of this administrator's security group, then that hacker has now compromised my account and can do whatever they want to the entire domain. They can start deleting user accounts, doing extremely malicious things. They could bring my company down just because they've been able to figure out my password, because it's way too powerful. However, if I'm logged on as just a generic user, like a domain user, which is, again, nested inside of the user's security group in Active Directory domains, then once they compromise that account, all they can really compromise is my own local user data or any other data that I save, whether it's in my documents or wherever. But they cannot bring down the entire company just on the basis of an individual user account in this group. Now, another critical element of security is something called physical access, or physical security is what we often refer to this as. Let's say that I'm a member of the user's security group, but I'm a disgruntled user. I didn't get promoted, and I thought that I should have, and that guy that's 20 years younger than me did get promoted, and he has hardly any experience. Now I'm mad at the company. Well, if we have critical systems like servers that are available and easy to access, then, everybody goes to lunch, and I'm the only one left in the office. I could go into that server room if it's not locked and secured, then I could start switching cables around, or just take a hammer to stuff and start damaging things. So I have to make sure that my physical access is secure, and this goes all the way throughout all the different kinds of computers that I'll have. First of all, just where their general workstations are, PCs. We need to make sure that those are restricted from any visitors to the company, so that if I have people that come in to visit in my lobby, I want to usually make sure that they remain in that lobby until they have an escort back to whichever department it is that they're visiting. I don't want people to be able to just freely roam throughout my company, because one of the tricks that hackers will use is they'll use something called social engineering, which we'll talk about later. But within social engineering, they can pretend to be a salesman, or they can pretend to know somebody else within the company, and then they can access physically any of the computers that you have, and they might be able to perform some kind of damaging actions on these computers. We also want to make sure that we properly secure our laptops. This is really getting to be a huge issue with a lot of corporations and government offices. If I remember right, the Veterans Administration data scandal that happened not too long ago, maybe a year ago I think it was, resulted in the fact that one of the IT professionals that was on contract with the VA lost his laptop, or it got stolen, and there was a portable hard drive that accompanied it that also got stolen, and it had critical information about various veterans, and I think it had private information, maybe social security numbers and things of this nature. Well, we have to be very careful with what happens to our laptops. Even the FBI and other government agencies have had laptops lost or stolen. Well, Microsoft has introduced with Windows Vista something called a BitLocker, so that if somebody loses their laptop or it gets stolen, nobody can be able to access the data on it anyway, because it encrypts everything and makes it impossible for people to be able to access it. Now, that is around the corner. We don't really have that yet within Windows XP and Windows 2000. I mean, yeah, we can encrypt individual files or even a folder of files, but we can't really secure the entire laptop at once. Plus, if somebody is able to gain physical access to my PC at my desktop or my laptop computer, or even if they can get into the server room, as long as they have physical access, there are certain utilities that you can use, and I have some of them, where I could just restart that computer, boot off of a CD, and I can reset the password for the administrator account. And if I can do that on your server, and I can reset the password to an administrative account, then I can access all of these other computers, anything else that's a member of the domain, and I'll have full administrative control over all of them. Another thing I could do there, besides booting off of those computers then, I would even be able to reinstall Windows and then take ownership of all the files and the folders that are on the hard drive. So if I'm really just concerned about the data and I want to steal some social security numbers or something sensitive like that, just by reinstalling Windows, I can take full ownership of all the files and put whatever permissions I want on them. And of course, that would include full control, which would allow me to do whatever I want. And then there's also restricted spaces. This is kind of a general term, but you just want to make sure that any place where you have something that could be security sensitive, servers especially, we want to make sure that they are restricted and secured properly. That could involve something like video surveillance, a security guard sitting at a desk, somebody that has a sign-in sheet. There must be always vigilant, watchful care taken to make sure that especially our servers are not physically accessed by people that they shouldn't be, but also PCs and laptops, of course, are also important. And then something that's not listed here or even on the A+ exam objectives, but something to still think about, are the proliferation now of PDAs. Because a lot of people that are really active in business and that travel a lot, for example, will have those PDA phone kinds of things. I didn't get one because I don't want to be working 24/7. But I know a lot of people have them, and they can also have sensitive email, sensitive files, sensitive information of many different types on those PDAs, and you got to make sure that those don't get lost or stolen either, because people can compromise those as well. Now, as important as physical security is, it's also important to secure our networks, because this does not really require any kind of physical access by hackers and malicious parties. They could be halfway around the world, and if we don't have our systems properly secured and our network secure, they could access our systems and remotely get into them, and we might not ever know because we don't see somebody sitting at the computer. So what we need to do is to, first of all, have some understanding of our firewalls. And there's several different ways of going with firewalls and several different ways that they behave. The most fundamental type of a firewall is going to be one that just does packet filtering. And a good example of that would be the firewall that's included with Windows, which we can access through right-clicking My Network Places, and then we can choose the properties. And when we get into that, we see that we have our local area connections here. Now we can change Windows firewall settings this way, or we can access the properties of a given network connection. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. If I use this link over here to the left, then this is going to change the settings for all of my firewall settings globally for all network adapters. Okay, so if I click cancel out of that, I can also adjust the settings just for this individual adapter by right-clicking and choosing properties here. Now, the initial look of it is going to be the same once I go to the advanced tab and then click on settings. I can still see the firewall settings here. Now, what this does is it's going to just block all the outside sources from connecting to this computer. So if there's an unsolicited attempt to access my machine, it will reject that attempt. So for example, a lot of times hackers will use Telnet to try to start or stop services on a remote computer, and then they'll try to use it to remotely control that computer. Well, of course, I want to block all efforts to do that. So what if I can do is to turn this on, and now any unsolicited attempts to access Telnet or to use Telnet will be denied. And Telnet takes place over TCP port 23. But there are certain exceptions to this as well. So for example, what if I'm at home and I just realized, oh man, I forgot to submit a report before I left work. Now I want to connect back to my computer using remote desktop. and I don't want to be denied. So what I'd have to do there is to set up an exception. And I would say, I will allow remote assistance. That would be an unsolicited connection attempt because it's being initiated from outside of my network, from outside of this computer. And of course, it would make sense for me then to select the remote desktop if I did want to remotely connect to this computer unsolicited. Another thing that takes place unsolicited is file and printer sharing. If I share a printer, I want people to be able to access it, and that would be them initiating the connection, making a connection to my computer to try to get that print job done. So I would enable that to take place. Other things we could do if we had additional ports or programs that we wanted to be able to allow people to initiate is we could click on Add Program, and then there are several things here that Microsoft kind of pre-builds that will allow us to allow unsolicited connections to come on through. For example, if I want internet checkers to take place, then I could click OK here, and now I could play checkers with somebody, and they could initiate the connection to my computer to play that game. I don't know that I would really want to do that. I'm just saying as an example. And if you want to delete any of these, you can do that as well. If you have specific ports that you want to allow or deny, in this case I'm going to allow, then I would enter them in here as well. So for example, maybe this was a system that we really did want to allow telnet access to because we wanted to, as administrators, remotely control it. Well, then I would configure TCP port 23 because that's what telnet operates on. Now I can also change the scope of that. So I would click Change Scope here, and I would say any computer, including those on the internet. Well, that might be too risky. But I can also say my own subnet only. And that way, only other computers that are on 10.10.10 networks would be able to make the connection. This is a private IP address range, so it would exclude anybody that's on the internet, and it would only allow people from within my own local computer network to access. So this gives you an idea of how you can configure a firewall setting with software using Microsoft Windows' own firewall configuration. The other things that we could use would be something like a proxy server. Let's go ahead and take a look at a proxy server as well as an IDS, or an intrusion detection system. Now, IDS is not on the A+ exam objectives, but it could be very handy to know about, and it is commonly found these days in corporations. So let's take a look at how a firewall works, and then I'll explain IDS as well as proxy servers. A firewall mostly does port blocking. So remember, we didn't want anyone from the internet to use telnet over TCP port 23 to access my server or to access any of my hosts inside the network. Well, if that's the case, I will probably block port 23. Now, most firewalls block everything, and then an administrator goes in there and determines what kind of traffic should be allowed. Maybe we want remote desktop protocol to come through, so we'd open up TCP port 3389, and we would create a rule that would allow only that port to come into our network. We might also have, an FTP server in here somewhere that would be in usually what we call a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ. Microsoft calls them perimeter networks, but the point of those is that they are protected by two levels of firewall. So I might have a firewall here, a software firewall that might be running ISA server, and then here's a firewall, maybe a Cisco firewall out here that protects from the internet. And in the middle, I might have additional servers connected. This might be an Exchange server. This could be a RAS server, web server, an FTP server, all those kinds of things. So if it was, let's say, an FTP server, and I wanted to allow my customers out on the internet to download brochures and things from it, then I might open up TCP port 20 and 21. And also, if you want to find out what services and services and applications are associated with different ports, you can Google for those, and it's quite easy to find all that information. But when it comes to the firewall, again, we're going to block all ports except for the ones we explicitly decide we want to allow in. And that would then allow, for example, TCP traffic to come through my firewall and make a connection to my FTP server here if I wanted. Now then, having cleaned up here, let's also talk about intrusion detection systems. This might be a separate physical device. Very often, a firewall is a rack-mounted device that will monitor the traffic from the internet and going out from my clients inside the network. It can also be an intrusion detection system. It might be a separate box, or it might be integrated into the firewall. The line between the two is kind of getting fuzzier as time goes by, because now we have a lot of companies that are capable of making a firewall and an IDS both in the same box. Well, what is an IDS? It performs the same kind of function. It's designed to secure my network, but it looks for suspicious kind of traffic. For example, a lot of times a hacker on the internet will send maybe a malformed packet to something in my DMZ or some other computer in here, and that malformed packet might be designed to deliberately crash that computer, for example. or to do something that we call a denial of service, which means that it will get that computer so busy trying to figure out that packet or that series of packets that it's too busy to actually do anything useful and productive for my own users. That's called, again, a denial of service. Well, things like intrusion detection systems, they can analyze the traffic as it comes through, and if it sees a packet that's of a strange size or strangely formed, then it can treat that packet as suspicious and then just start dropping those packets and not allowing them to pass on through. And at that point, it becomes basically like a firewall in that it's going to block certain kinds of traffic. We also have another kind of a solution, and that would be a proxy server. And this is very often what you'll see, by the way. You'll see maybe a proxy server here, and then a DMZ with my web server, my mail server, and some other kinds of servers that I want the internet to be able to access. And then I'll see a firewall here, and it could be a Cisco firewall of some kind, or Cisco router, some kind of a device here that's a second level of protection against hackers. So I'm protected against hackers here and here. Now the proxy server here, and the common product for this is called ISA server from Microsoft, and it stands for Internet Security and Acceleration. And I've explained that to you in the past a little bit, but the main idea with this is it accesses the internet for my users under a single IP address that looks to the internet as if it's a very, very busy user, because it's accessing the internet for all of these users in here. So it also will then, as a result of this, obscure the actual identity of my users that are trying to access the internet, because it doesn't reveal my own individual information here or my specific IP address from within my network. And as mentioned earlier also, the ISA server can accelerate the traffic as well. So if we've retrieved web pages from the internet in the past recently, and I've retrieved it and given it to this computer, if this computer now also requests those same web pages, then we'll deliver it out of the cache on the ISA server instead of going all the way out to the internet and retrieving it again. And then we also want to protect ourselves from malicious software. Of course, the malicious software that we'll see here are things like this. A virus, for example. You're probably pretty familiar with a virus, but this is just like a human virus in that it can transfer and be communicated to other people, or in this case, other computers, quite easily. This can take place through a program, for example. So maybe you have a program with a virus attached to it. It might be a script. It might be a Word document with a virus embedded inside of it. It can be really transmitted a number of different ways, and it can damage your computer. Some of them are just going to be practical jokes or might give you a message that's intended to be humorous, but more often than not, they're also malicious, and they can destroy data, they can ruin boot partitions, they can do quite a lot of damage and bring a company down if they're not checked very carefully. And then there's also Trojans. Trojans are very similar to a virus. But just like the mythological soldiers that were inside of the horse that snuck into the city, so a Trojan will sneak into your computer because you actually invited it. You thought it was a gift. You thought it was a really cool new utility or program of some kind that's supposed to make your computer twice as fast. And yet when you install it, what it really does is it unleashes a program inside of your computer that could be malicious and act like a virus, for example. And then these things get passed around the internet because people think they're cool utilities or something, when in reality they have some kind of a malicious program in it. Very often they also have a remote control program in them. I remember a few years ago around the internet there was this program called the Whack-A-Mole program, and it was actually just a game, and it was like the arcade game of Whack-A-Mole. Well, some of them were innocuous, but somebody had decided to inject a utility called NetBus into some of those Whack-A-Mole games, and so when people installed the Whack-A-Mole game, what actually happened was remote hackers on the internet would be able to take control of their computers using the utility called NetBus. So again, it was a Trojan because it looked like something good that we invited in, but in reality, it had controlling software on it that was malicious to our systems. And then there's a worm. A worm is very similar to a virus, except that a worm does not necessarily require any user interaction. A lot of these are going to be email worms. So for example, you receive a worm as an attachment in email, and you might not even have to do anything to it. You might even just preview it in Microsoft Outlook. That might be enough to get it launched, and it will then send itself out to everybody within your contact list. So it's self-replicating, and also embedded in that worm could be something, again, that's malicious, that will allow someone else to remotely control your computer or damage files or damage the operating system. We also want to be sure that we protect ourselves from spyware or adware. Now, in its most innocuous form, this is really just a nuisance. So you're happily working along, and then a dialog box or an Internet Explorer window pops up saying, "Buy my product," or refinance your house for only 5.25% interest, or any of these other kinds of ads you get, or might some get a message that pops up saying you need to prescribe to these little blue pills or something. These things probably might not damage your computer or destroy data, but they're annoying, and because a lot of times this spyware or adware is poorly written, it can also be a drain on your system because it might create what we call a memory leak, in which case it will just start to use memory, and then it will return memory that it's already used, and it just starts chewing up memory and gobbling it all up way more than it needs to actually be able to operate, and that will then slow your computer down. A lot of times adware begets adware as well, because once it's installed on your system, it can seek out and retrieve additional adware, and at that point it comes something a little bit more like one of these other threats that we see here. Now, spyware is probably more damaging than adware because spyware is going to actually track what you're doing. It can track your shopping habits, and it might just be a marketing tool, but it could also be more malicious. It could be something like a keystroke logger, and if that's the case, then it will be able to see what you type in for your passwords. And then periodically, what they usually do is it'll build up a log file of everything that you've typed in, and then without your knowledge, it'll send it off maybe in an email or send it off some other way to a destination where a hacker will then be able to open up that log file and see exactly everything you've typed, including your private messages, your letters, your email, anything else that you've typed in on your keyboard. And that's very often from, again, a keystroke logger, which can be embedded in probably just about any of these things that we've already listed here. And then, of course, there's spam. Jeez, I can hardly stand it. Spam, of course, is that unsolicited email that can try to offer you different things to buy or different websites to go to, and much of it's highly inappropriate for the workplace. So most of the time nowadays we have some kind of a spam filter, and it can even be a hardware spam filter that protects us much like an intrusion detection system does. And it may be integrated into whatever your email server program is. And whenever it sees something that's suspiciously like spam, it can send it into a special mailbox for checking later on, or you as the user might be able to check it out as well. And then periodically just go into your spam folder or whatever that application calls it and see whether or not it's all spam. Sometimes legitimate messages do get caught in the spam filter, and you just have to kind of get them out. But overall, it's a necessary evil, and it's well worth losing some messages at times just so that we can filter out all of the negative spam that we get. In fact, I recently had to change accounts because I was getting so much spam that I was getting thousands of spam messages a day. It's an email account that I've had for years. But that's not really the whole reason why I canceled it. Moreover, what happened was a hacker or some spam group out there on the internet got a hold of my email address, and they started spoofing my email address, so they were sending out millions of spam messages under my email address, and there's nothing you can do about that. So I just had to eventually close the account down. Now, we just talked about spam and viruses, trojans, adware, spyware, that sort of thing. One thing that's important to do when you train your users is to make sure that they know how to work with those kinds of things and to prevent them. Just about every machine should have antivirus software. In fact, every machine should. And you need to train your users what to do if a message pops up and it says that a virus has been detected. So they do need that kind of training. And the other thing that you might consider installing on all their computers is some kind of an adware or spyware removal tool. I use Windows Defender because it's free. All you have to do is to validate that you have a legitimate copy of Windows when you install it, and then it will run in the background for you. Now, as far as your antivirus software is concerned, I use Symantec's antivirus. I use a corporate edition of this, and I just frequently make sure that I get an updated virus definition file. This means that if a new virus comes out and I've got the latest update to the virus definition file, that Symantec's antivirus can identify that new virus and be able to stop it. Whereas if I have an old antivirus file and a new virus that's trying to infect my computer, this utility will not be able to identify it as a virus and could let it slip through. The other thing you can do there is you can configure this so that it will automatically look for new virus definition files on a regular basis without your intervention. And most antivirus software will do that for you. And in the corporation, you'll probably have an antivirus server somewhere that downloads all the updates for all the users, and then it will automatically distribute them to your clients, much like software update services can do from Microsoft for other kinds of updates, such as patches, fixes, and operating system updates. And then finally, as kind of a good overall security measure, one of the best things you can do is to always make sure that you're running NTFS. In order to be able to do this, if I'm already running FAT32, for example, then I would need to convert that drive. Now, there are some utilities that can do this for me, but I can also do this from a command line by typing in convert space and then whatever drive letter, maybe it's drive C, and then I would do a space, and then I would do /FS colon and then NTFS. So I want to convert drive C to the file system of NTFS and then press enter, and then it will convert that drive to the appropriate file system. Now, we talked about wireless networks in a previous nugget, but just in summary here again, let's take a look at the wireless encryption standards that we have. The first one that was available pretty much was WEP. That stands for Wired Equivalent Privacy. And it is easily cracked. It does use encryption, but there are utilities out there such as WEPCrack, that's WEPCRACK, which were able to sniff this web traffic, and then they were able to derive through certain kinds of calculations what the original WEP key was, because this really uses a shared key that both the client computer and the wireless access point have in common. Once it figures out what that key is, then they can also get on the network and then to start doing more damaging things. So this again uses an algorithm that was easily cracked. Then there's also Wi-Fi protected access. This is much stronger. I'm not going to say it's invulnerable, but for the most part it's pretty trustworthy and it's much more difficult to crack. And then don't forget that also, in order to help secure your networks, you want to turn off your SSID, and that is your service set identifier, and that broadcasts the presence of your wireless access point. Now, it's still possible to be able to find a wireless access point even if you turned off the SSID, but at least it stops the casual ward driver from going around and scooping up wireless access points. Also, be careful of things like unused wireless access points. Because remember, a wireless access point is a potential security vulnerability. If it's unused, it's probably been forgotten about. It's just sitting under somebody's desk, or it's sitting in the conference room over in the corner, and nobody even remembers why we have it in there. Well, it could be that it was never properly secured, or it used a previous version of security. Maybe it used WEP, and it's been there for a long time. Now everybody forgot all about it. We're using Wi-Fi protected access on our monitored wireless access points, but nobody remembers that one in the conference room. So unused wireless access points, make sure you do a site survey and identify where they might be, and then disconnect them, because they're not doing anybody any good, and they could open up a security vulnerability because they don't have as secure settings as your current wireless access points. And then you can also use a wireless access point as a firewall, and let's go ahead and take a look at that. And for this, I've just gone to a wireless access point here that I've got set up for security so that it's enabled the firewall. And then it's just going to block any of the traffic that I don't explicitly allow through this section over here, this applications and gaming. Now, depending on the brand, it'll be look a little bit differently. But the applications and gaming, the reason why it's called that is because a lot of internet games need to use a specific port, and then I would be able to play internet games with a friend of mine, for example. So I would have to open up that port. For example, I think the old game Doom was on port 666. So that would be the name of the game. Actually, I put the application in there. And then that would be on port 666. And we could configure that on both TCP or UDP or both of those ports. And then anytime someone tried to make a connection on that port, I could direct them to whatever computer was running the Doom game. Maybe that was 10.10.10.39, for example. And then I would enable that, and then I would save the changes down here. And then what would happen is, much like the software firewall that we looked at for Windows XP, we have now configured a port that would allow unsolicited connections into my network. Now, most of the things we see in this list really appear on the A+ exam objectives in a number of different locations, and they're not all grouped together. But I think we can summarize these all up together as things that would be included within a company policy. For example, incidents reporting. If you're looking through the event logs and you see that thousands of attempts have been made to try to compromise a specific user account, then you should probably report that. On the other hand, if you see that someone has attempted to log onto their account twice and then they failed, but they were successful on the third time, well, that's probably just indicative of a user who forgot that they had changed their password, and then on the third time they remembered, oh, that's right, I changed it to chocolate chip cookie or something like that. Oh, great. Now I've done it. I went and made myself hungry. But anyway, so you have to identify what kind of an incident requires reporting and then who you report that to. This is a matter of company policy. It's not really something that I can say you must do it this way or you must do it that way. Usually there's some kind of a committee or a team that gets together to determine what kind of incidents need to be reported, to whom, and how they're reported. So for example, if it's a pretty critical emergency and you're currently under an onslaught from a hacker gang, for example, that's probably something that should be reported immediately. And very often with larger corporations and financial institutions and the like, there's probably an incident response team that will then track down that, for example, that hacking attempt, and they will then take an immediate course of action to determine what to do. And there will probably also be in your company policy a description of how to report the incident. If it's something that can wait or that's not time sensitive, you might just send an email or you might fill out an online form. If it's something that's taking place immediately right now, or you suspect a security problem is currently under attack, then you probably need to report it by making a call to your immediate supervisor or to the incident response team. And then there's also disaster response. What happens if the server room catches on fire? Who do you call? Or if there's suddenly a pipe that bursts and there's water filling up underneath the floor in the server room. Guess what? In a lot of cases, your first call is not to call 911. Your first call is really to call the supervisor or an incident response team. Now, there are a number of different reasons for this, which we don't need to exhaust, but one of the reasons is so that you can absolve yourself of any liability and put decision-making processes in the hands of people that get paid for that kind of stuff. And then social engineering is something that we need to be on guard against as well. As help desk technicians, as high-level technicians, and as general users. We're all falling victims at times, or all have fallen victim, to social engineering attacks. This is where somebody else just derives information from another person, not even using technical tools. They'll just say, hey, you know what, we're trying to get into these files. The president of the company wants these right now. He's getting ready to make a presentation. We can't get the files off of his laptop. Something bad happened. So give us the password to this server. We need it right now. And of course, somebody will panic and say, great Scott, the president's mad. So they'll just give up the password. Now, increasingly, people are getting better educated about this kind of thing, but generally speaking, social engineering is a big threat, and they usually use a number of different psychological factors, such as trying to get sympathy. Oh man, my boss is going to kill me. I lost the report. Can you give me the password to the server? If I don't get it by the end of the day, I'm going to get fired. You know, you can use sympathy for things like that. Or fear, letting that person think that they're in trouble and that their job is in jeopardy because they didn't do what you told them to do. If they don't straighten it out right now and give you the password to something, then they could lose their job. And social engineering takes place in a lot of different ways. It's not just trying to get passwords out of people. It might be trying to gain physical access to a location that they're not supposed to access. Somebody once said that if you walk into any building with a clipboard and a necktie, you can get anywhere you want to. As long as you look like you're busy, industrious, and like you're supposed to be there, you can go a lot of places. Well, social engineering might allow people to gain access to places that they're not supposed to. So we need to keep alert to that, and that's a big part of what user training needs to be. We need to tell our users when they first get hired on at the company, for example, and in writing, such as in our employee manuals, that the help desk and IT personnel and nobody else will ever ask them for their password. So if someone asks for their password, that they should report that immediately. An acceptable use policy is also a big part of a company policy. We need to identify what kind of email people can send. Should it be strictly related to business, or do you want to loosen it up and let people be social as well? If you do, frankly, you open yourself up to a little bit there in terms of liability. What if somebody uses company email to send a sexually harassing message to somebody else? Well, they used your company's computers, therefore that could be construed as the company being liable. What kind of internet websites can people go to? Can they shop for gifts during Christmas on Amazon.com? Or is that not considered an acceptable company use of that computer? Or if they can do it, can they do it during working hours, or do they have to wait for a lunch break, for example, or after hours? So these are all things that need to be considered in acceptable use. Also, other things such as, can they go to YouTube? You know, YouTube is a great site, very entertaining, but it chews up a lot of bandwidth because it's streaming video. Do we want to use up our internet connection because people are streaming YouTube videos? Or do we want to allow people to go to inappropriate websites? Probably not. Pornographic websites or even sexually suggestive websites. Do we want them to be able to access that? So there's certainly a lot of things that need to be nailed down and clearly defined in acceptable use for purposes of company protection against liability, and it can also protect the users against liability there as well. And then you should also do a site survey. Now, a site survey largely relates to wireless networks because we want to make sure that wherever we put a wireless access point, it's in a location where we can direct the antennas in such a way that we can get maximum coverage in most places. Typically, I put wireless access points in centralized locations and let them beacon out from the central portion of the building out towards the walls. And then outside of the walls, they'll of course get weaker and weaker. We try not to put them near walls where they can then broadcast out of our building and into the parking lot, into places where other people will more easily be able to access our signals. But the site survey is certainly a part of that, and you also need to use the site survey to identify where you might have weak spots or dead spots within your building where a wireless access point is not adequately broadcasting its radio waves. And those would be certainly spots that we might not want to put in an additional wireless access point. And the site survey is usually something that you'll revisit every so often. Might just be annually, for example. And maybe there's been new buildings put up near your building, or there's been reconstruction done within your building, and you need to go through that site survey again and see if maybe a cinder block wall went up somewhere that's partially blocking some radio signals, and you might need to, again, install another access point or move some other ones around. In this nugget, we talked about security, and this was part 2, where we started off with a discussion of various security groups and what their capabilities are. And we also talked about securing networks. Remember, we do that a lot of the times through firewalls or intrusion detection systems. But we can also do that in other ways by using antivirus software, anti-spyware kinds of software to protect individual computers. And I also showed you how to configure the Windows XP firewall. And then we saw also that we can secure wireless networks as well, primarily by using one of 2 different encryption standards, WEP or WEP, and Wi-Fi Protected Access or WPA, with WPA being the more secure of the 2. And then we also looked at company policy, which is an important thing to put down in writing, and it's important sometimes for legal purposes, but it's also important so that we can make sure that we have a defined procedure for what to do under different circumstances. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.